History remembers countless kings, generals, and emperors, men who led armies, built empires, and carved their names into stone. But sometimes the greatest stories are not of men, but of women who rose against the impossible. In the jungles of ancient Vietnam, in the year 248 AD, when the land was ruled by the mighty Eastern Wu of China, a warrior emerged unlike any the world had ever seen. She was only 19 years old, yet she climbed onto the back of a war elephant clad in golden armor and declared war on an empire. Her name was Lady Trieu, known to the Vietnamese as Triu Thi Trinh. And in the span of just a few months, she would lead thousands into battle, shatter enemy armies, and etch her name into the memory of a nation. This is the story of how a teenage girl became a living legend, of how one woman made the most powerful empire of the East tremble. After the collapse of the Han Dynasty, southern Vietnam, then called Jiaoji, fell into the hands of the Eastern Wu, one of the three kingdoms of China. To the rulers of Wu, Jiaoji was not a homeland to protect, but a colony to exploit. The people lived under crushing burdens. Heavy taxes stripped villages of their harvests. Young men were forced into labor, building fortifications for a foreign empire. Even women were not spared, taken as servants or concubines to officials sent from afar. The forests and rivers of Vietnam, once free, echoed with the cries of the oppressed. But deep in the mountains of Thanh Hoa province, a different voice was rising. The voice of a girl who refused to kneel. Her name was Triu Thi Trinh, but history would remember her simply as Lady Trieu. Born into hardship, orphaned at a young age, she was raised in a land where survival meant submission. Yet she possessed a fire that no conqueror could extinguish. At just 19 years old, Lady Trieu declared, "I want to ride the storm, kill the whales of the Eastern Sea, and drive away the invaders. I refuse to bow my head and be anyone's concubine." It was not just defiance, it was a war cry. And soon that cry would ignite a rebellion that shook the empire itself. In the quiet valleys of Thanh Hoa, word of Lady Trieu's defiance spread like wildfire. At first it was whispers, tales told around cooking fires, rumors passed between weary farmers and traveling merchants. But soon those whispers grew into a storm. A young woman, barely 19, had mounted a war elephant, declared her freedom, and dared to fight an empire. To a people beaten down by decades of oppression, her courage was like rain on scorched earth. Villagers who had long bowed their heads in silence began to lift their eyes with hope. One by one, families abandoned their fields and joined her. At first, it was a few dozen, then a few hundred. Within weeks, thousands stood under her banner. Lady Trieu was no ordinary leader. Unlike the generals of Wu, who commanded from behind fortified walls, she lived among her soldiers. She ate the same rice, drank the same water, and marched through the same mud. But when the drums of war thundered, she rose above them all, towering on the back of her elephant, golden armor glinting in the sun. To her followers, she was not just a commander, she was a vision of strength itself. Her army was as diverse as the land it came from. Farmers with sickles, hunters with spears, fishermen with nets turned into weapons. Women marched beside men, refusing to remain behind while their homes were burned. They called her the Lady General clad in gold. Her presence transformed ordinary villagers into fearless warriors. The tactics were simple but devastating. They knew the forests, the rivers, and the hidden trails where even Wu soldiers dared not go. They struck suddenly, vanishing like shadows before the enemy could respond. Patrols were ambushed in narrow mountain passes. Outposts were burned in midnight raids. Supply convoys disappeared, swallowed by the jungle. For the first time in years, the Eastern Wu felt fear. Reports arrived in their garrisons. A mysterious young woman leading rebels from the mountains, defeating trained soldiers with peasant militias. Some Chinese officials dismissed it as a rumor, a superstition meant to embolden the locals. But when columns of their troops began to fall, they realized the truth. Lady Triu had become a living legend. Songs were sung about her before battles, prayers whispered in her name. To the oppressed, she was a savior. To the empire, she was a storm they could not control. But storms grow by feeding on chaos. And as Lady Triu's fame spread, so too did the wrath of the Eastern Wu. The empire would not allow a teenage girl to humiliate them for long. They began to prepare their armies, not to chase bandits, but to destroy a rebellion that threatened their very authority. The rebellion had grown too large to ignore. For the Eastern Wu, what began as whispers of a mountain girl had turned into reports of entire garrisons wiped out. The empire could no longer dismiss Lady Triu as a legend. She was a threat. In the spring of 248 AD, the Wu court dispatched veteran generals to crush the uprising. They brought thousands of soldiers, equipped with steel swords, long spears, and crossbows. Against them stood Lady Triu's force, farmers, hunters, and women in homemade armor, armed with whatever weapons they could forge. On paper, it was no contest. Yet in the jungles and rivers of Vietnam, the empire would learn that wars are not fought on paper. Lady Triu understood the terrain better than any enemy commander. The forests were her walls, the rivers her moats. She refused to meet the Wu in open plains where their formations and cavalry would dominate. Instead, she turned Vietnam itself into a weapon. Her first strategy was ambush. At narrow mountain passes, she ordered her men to fell trees, blocking the roads. When Wu troops struggled to clear the path, rebels rained down arrows and rolling boulders from above. Entire columns were trapped and slaughtered without ever seeing their enemy's face. Her second tactic was deception. Knowing the Wu relied heavily on supply convoys, Lady Triu staged false retreats. Her rebels would flee into the jungle, leaving behind traces of panic. When Wu soldiers pursued, confident of victory, they stumbled into traps, pitfalls lined with sharpened stakes, rivers where boats overturned in swift currents, valleys where elephants charged from hidden ridges. The most daring strike came against a fortified Wu outpost near Kuchan. At night, Lady Triu herself led the attack, her golden armor gleaming under torchlight. Riding atop her elephant, she charged the gates, rallying her troops with cries that echoed through the dark. Arrows clattered harmlessly against her armor as her warriors scaled the walls. By dawn, the outpost was in flames, its garrison destroyed. News of the victory spread like wildfire. To the Vietnamese, it was proof that courage and cunning could overcome numbers and steel. To the Wu, it was humiliation. How could an empire be outwitted by a teenage girl in her peasant army? But the Wu were not easily broken. With each defeat, they studied her methods, adjusted their strategies, and returned in greater force. What began as scattered skirmishes turned into larger battles. One clash near the Ma River became a test of wills. The Wu fielded thousands of soldiers in tight formations, their crossbows aimed in deadly precision. Lady Triu responded with elephants at the front, charging into enemy lines with terrifying momentum. Spears splintered under the weight of the beasts, formations broke, and panic spread. Yet the Wu counterattacked with fire, hurling flaming arrows at the elephants to drive them wild. Chaos erupted on both sides as screams filled the night air. Even in moments of near defeat, Lady Triu's presence held her army together. She was always at the front, never hiding behind her men. Her golden armor, shining in the chaos, became a beacon. To fight under her gaze was to believe the impossible was within reach. Each battle was a gamble of wit against power, of speed against numbers. And though Lady Triu won victory after victory, she knew the empire's strength was endless. For every garrison destroyed, another marched south. For every supply line cut, another was restored. The question was not whether she could fight, but how long she could endure. Still, for months, she made the Eastern Wu tremble. By the summer of 248 AD, the war had reached its breaking point. Lady Triu's rebellion had shaken the Eastern Wu to its core, yet for all her victories, she knew the empire would never stop. With every defeat they suffered, they returned in greater numbers, more disciplined, more determined. The decisive clash came in Than Hoa, the land where the rebellion was born. The Wu commanders, furious at months of humiliation, gathered an overwhelming force. Veterans hardened by countless campaigns marched south, their armor gleaming, their banners stretching like a sea of red across the horizon. Lady Triu stood atop her elephant, gazing at the vast army arrayed before her. She knew this would be the final battle. Her troops, though brave, were exhausted. Supplies ran low, weapons dulled, and every family had already buried brothers, fathers, and sons. But retreat was not an option. The night before the battle, Lady Triu gathered her warriors. The jungle was silent, broken only by the crackle of campfires. She spoke with fire in her voice. Better to die in glory than to live in shame. If we yield today, our children will bow for generations. If we fight, even in defeat, our courage will outlive us. Her words spread like sparks, igniting hearts. Men and women who had lost everything found new strength. They tightened their grips on spears, checked the bindings of their armor, and vowed to fight until the very end. At dawn, the Wu advanced. Drums thundered, shaking the earth. Their soldiers marched in disciplined ranks, shields locked, spears bristling. Behind them, cavalry charged, dust rising like storm clouds. Lady Trieu ordered her elephants forward. The beasts roared as they crashed into enemy lines, tusks and trunks scattering men like broken reeds. For a moment, the Wu faltered, their formations torn apart. Rebels surged from the forests, striking with spears and arrows. The battlefield became chaos, but the Wu were prepared. They unleashed waves of fire arrows, setting grass and trees ablaze. Smoke blinded the rebels. The elephants screamed in terror. Wu cavalry exploited the confusion, charging through gaps, cutting down men and women alike. Lady Triu fought at the center of it all. From atop her elephant, she swung her spear with unmatched ferocity, cutting down soldiers as they swarmed around her. Arrows clattered against her golden armor, but she did not flinch. Her voice rose above the din of war, rallying her fighters again and again. Hours passed and still the rebels held, but exhaustion took its toll. For every Wu soldier who fell, 3 more seemed to take his place. The ground grew slick with blood, the rivers clogged with bodies. The cries of the dying drowned out the drums. At last the Wu surrounded them. Thousands pressed from every side, slowly tightening the noose. Lady Triu's elephant, once a symbol of unstoppable power, was now cornered. Her soldiers, bloodied and battered, looked to her one last time. She knew what awaited if she were captured. Chains, humiliation, her story twisted by her enemies. That was a fate worse than death. And so, in the final hour, Lady Trieu chose defiance. With her golden spear raised high, she let out one last battle cry, a sound that pierced the battlefield like thunder. Her warriors answered, fighting with desperate fury even as they fell. Surrounded, exhausted, yet unbroken, Lady Trieu ended her life on her own terms. She was only 23 years old. The battlefield fell silent. The Wu had won, but it was not a victory they would celebrate. For though Lady Triu's body lay still, her spirit could not be killed. The empire had crushed an army, but they could not erase a legend. The battlefield fell silent, but the echoes of Lady Triu's defiance would never fade. Though the Eastern Wu claimed victory, what they won was nothing more than ashes and blood. For the people of Vietnam, Lady Triu's fall was not an end. It was the beginning of a legend. Word of her final stand spread faster than any imperial proclamation. Survivors carried her story from village to village. They spoke of the teenage girl who rode elephants into battle, who turned forests into fortresses, who faced thousands with nothing but courage. Mothers told her tale to children at night, not as tragedy, but as inspiration. Fathers whispered her words, better to die in glory than live in shame. as they tilled the same fields once seized by foreign rulers. The Eastern Wu thought they had crushed a rebellion. In truth, they had ignited a fire that could never be extinguished. For generations after her death, peasants would rise again and again, invoking Lady Triu's name as a rallying cry. To them, she was not a defeated rebel, but a guardian spirit. Temples were built in her honor across Tanhoa and beyond. Altars bore her name. Incense, smoke rising like prayers carried to the heavens. Warriors prayed to her before battle. Women especially saw in her a mirror of their own strength, a reminder that courage was not bound by gender or age. Centuries later, when other heroes rose, like the Trung sisters before her, or future leaders who would resist foreign domination, Lady Triu's spirit was always invoked. She stood as part of a lineage of resistance, a chain of fire stretching through Vietnamese history. Her story even crossed borders. Chinese records mention her rebellion with both frustration and awe, unable to comprehend how a woman so young could defy an empire. Later scholars compared her to Joan of Arc, another woman who fought against overwhelming odds centuries after her. But to the Vietnamese, Lady Trieu needed no comparison. She was their own flame, their own warrior saint. Her legend grew with time. In some tales, she was said to stand over 9 feet tall, her voice echoing like thunder. In others, her elephant was white as snow, a divine beast that carried her into the heavens after her final battle. These were not lies, but symbols, the language of a people who refused to let her memory fade. And through every retelling, one truth remained unshaken. Lady Trieu had chosen resistance over submission, fire over silence, freedom over chains. Her death was not defeat, but a seed that grew into centuries of defiance against empires that sought to rule Vietnam. The Wu may have won the battle, but Lady Trieu had claimed eternity. Centuries have passed since Lady Triu's voice thundered across the mountains of Tan Hoa. Empires rose and fell, dynasties crumbled, new powers emerged, but her story endured. In Vietnam today, her temples still stand. Statues of a young woman clad in armor, riding a war elephant, remind every visitor that freedom has always demanded courage. School children learn her name not as a rebel, but as a hero. Farmers still bow their heads in prayer before her altars. Soldiers speak of her in the same breath as the greatest defenders of the land. To historians, she is a symbol of resistance. To women, she is proof that courage knows no gender. To the people of Vietnam, she is an immortal flame, passed from one generation to the next. And beyond Vietnam, her story carries a universal truth, that even the smallest voice can rise against the greatest empire, that even a 19-year-old girl can shake the pillars of history. Lady Triu's life was short, her rebellion crushed. But legends are not measured in years or victories. They are measured in the fire they leave behind, and her fire still burns. Perhaps somewhere in the rustle of leaves in Tan Hoa's forest, or in the distant echoes of drums along the Ma River, her spirit still rides, forever searching, forever calling the oppressed to rise. Her battle may be over, but her war for freedom, for dignity, for the soul of a people lives on.